This is part 2 of section 6.5. We left off at example 8. Example 9 I'm going to have you do on your own. So let's take a look at example 10. Remember, the first thing you want to look for is the GCF. Do they have any numbers in common or any variables in common? If you look at 6, negative 26, and negative 20, you notice that they do have 2 in common. We're going to factor out a 2. If I take 6x squared and divide out a 2, that leaves me with 3x squared. If I have negative 26x and divide out a 2, I get negative 13x. And if I take negative 20 and divide out a 2, I get negative 10. Always when you factor out the GCF, check to see if you can factor what's inside. This is a trinomial, so we are going to factor it, or at least we're going to try to factor it. We could use any method we want to for factoring trinomials. We could use the box method. We could use the AC method. I recommend the AC method because that number right there, you have a 3, that's a coefficient. It does tend to make things more challenging or more work if you use the box method. So let's do the AC method. Remember the AC method, you multiply A times C. So if I take 3 and multiply it times negative 10, I get negative 30. And what I'm looking for are two numbers that will multiply to get negative 30, but add to get negative 13. So you might think 3 and 10, right? 3 and 10 certainly add up to 13. But since this is a negative 30, that means that either the 3 or the 10 have to be negative. So let's check. If 3 is negative, and we add those up, that will give us a positive 7, which is not negative 13. On the other hand, if the 10 is negative, and we add those up, that'll give us a negative 7, which again is not what we're looking for. So 3 and 10 aren't going to work for us. So let's check. Maybe another number will work. And I'm looking at maybe 2 and 15. So if I have positive 2 and maybe negative 15 and I add those up, that does give me a negative 13. So this is the pair of numbers I'm looking for. So I still have the 2. You got to keep that 2 all the way along. You got to keep the 2. And I have my 3x squared. That doesn't change. But instead of writing negative 13x, I'm going to put positive 2x and negative 15x. I still have my negative 10. All right, now we have 4 terms. Whenever you have 4 terms, you're going to group. Still have the 2 out front. The first 2 terms, we're going to check to see what they have in common. And they don't have a number in common, but they do have a variable. So we're going to divide out the x, and that gives us 3x plus 2. For the second set of numbers, we've got a negative 15 and we've got a negative 10. They have a 5 in common, but be careful because this is negative. We're going to divide out a negative 5. Be careful when dividing out a negative. If I have negative 15x divided by negative 5, it gives me a positive 3x. And if I have a negative 10 divide out a negative 5, that gives me a positive 2. Remember, those two have to match exactly, including the sign. Still have that 2 in front. 3x plus 2. And what's left when we take out the 3x plus 2, we have x minus 5. Let's take a look at example 11. I do not have a GCF. I do have a trinomial. This one, let's go back to our box method because there's no coefficient in front, or the coefficient is 1. And yes, I realize that that's x to the 4th, but we're still going to put that in the upper left-hand corner, and the constant is still going to go in the lower right. We do have to think about this for a minute. Normally, we would have x on the outside to get us an x squared. That's not x squared. That is an x to the fourth. So rather than x times x, that's going to be x squared times x squared. The rest of it is exactly the same as what we would do before. So I have 6, and I need to multiply something to get a positive 6, and this is negative. So since that's negative, both of these have to be negative. And I'm seeing 1 and 6. So let's check that. If I take x squared times negative 6, I get negative 6x squared. Negative 1 times x squared gives me negative 1x squared. And if I combine like terms, that gives me negative 7x squared, which is exactly what I was looking for. So right now I have x squared minus 1, x squared minus 6. Anytime you have an x squared in one set of parentheses, you have to check to see if what's inside is factorable. This is a square, this is a square, and this is a minus. That gives us a difference of squares. So this is factorable. So x squared minus 1 is going to factor to x plus 1, x minus 1 using the formula from above. This is a square, but this is not. 6 is not a square. So x squared minus 6 you do have to factor this completely. If you leave it as x squared minus 1, x squared minus 6, that will be incorrect. Example 12, I'm going to have you do on your own. Let's take a look at example 13. We have 8x cubed minus 125. Neither one, we do not have a GCF, so we don't have to worry about that. We have two terms, which is a binomial, so it's either going to be, and it is subtract, so it's either going to be a difference of squares or difference of cubes. Since this x is cubed, that's a pretty good indication that you're going to use the difference of cubes formula. So first thing you have to do is figure out what you had to cube to get 8, and that would have been 2. And what did you have to cube to get x cubed, and that would be x. 125 is also a cube. If I take 5 times 5 times 5, that will give me 125. From here, it's just a matter of plugging things into the formula. So the formula says I'm going to take a minus b, so I have 2x minus 5. Then I'm going to square my a, which is 2x squared. Be very careful here. You have to square the 2, you have to square the x. If this is plus, or if this is minus, then this has to be plus. So these are always opposite signs. These two are always opposite. Next, I need to multiply a times b, so that will give me a 2x times a 5. Plus, in the formula that is always plus. Doesn't matter whether we have sum or difference. And now we need b squared, 5 squared, and simplify. 2x minus 5, nothing I can do about that. But 2x times 2x gives me 4x squared. 2x times 5 gives me 10x. And 5 times 5 is 25. Going to have you do on your own. 15, again on your own. Let's take a look at example 16. Example 16 says solve. It's already factored for you, so you just have to set each factor equal to 0. 2 is a factor. Set it equal to 0. x minus 4 equals 0, and x plus 5 is equal to 0. And solve each one. Take a look at this. Is 2 equal to 0? Well, no. So you don't have to worry about this one. X minus 4 is equal to 0. We're going to add 4 and get x equal 4. And the last one, subtract 5 and get x equals negative 5. When you're solving these, if I have two variables, I need two answers, which I did get. 17, do on your own. Let's take a look at example 18. When you're doing these, they do have to equal 0. In this case, it equals 60. So to equal it to 0, I'm going to subtract 60 from both sides of the equal sign. I have x squared plus 7x minus 60 equals 0. I'm going to solve by factoring. There's no GCF. It has three terms. Let's use the box. So we have x squared and negative 60. So since we have x squared, it's going to be x times x. And the 60 is negative, so one has to be negative and one has to be positive. And what we're looking for is two numbers that will multiply to get negative 60. All right, so if we multiply 5 times 12, we get 60. So let's try a negative 5 and a positive 12. X times 12 will give us 12x, and negative 5 times x will give us a negative 5x. And if we add those together, we do get a 7x, which is good. That's what we're looking for. So our factors, x minus 5, x plus 12 equals 0. And we're going to set each factor equal to 0. So x minus 5 equals 0, x plus 12 equals 0. We're going to add 5 and subtract 12. If you have an x squared, you need two answers, two x values as answers. Example 19. Check for GCF. Notice I have 2 will go into all three of those, so will x. So I'm going to divide out 2x. I have x squared plus 9x plus 14 is equal to 0. I still have to factor what's inside, so let's draw a box. We've got x squared and 14. We're looking for two numbers that will multiply to get 14. So let's try a positive 7 and a positive 2. Will give me 2x and 7x. 2x plus 7x will give me a 9x, which is what I'm looking for, so these factors are correct. So I've got my 2x, still got the 2x, can't leave that one alone. You got the x plus 7, x plus 2 is equal to 0. To solve it, you're going to set each factor equal to 0. So 2x equals 0, x plus 7 equals 0, and x plus 2 is equal to 0. Divide by 2. Subtract 7. And subtract 2. Notice I have 3 answers, and since I had an x cubed, I need 3 answers. And there you go.